In the northeastern Pacific Ocean, off the coast of Australia, there are several countries made up of hundreds of islands. One of these is the Kingdom of Tonga, consisting of 169 islands and a population of 104,000. And it is right here in the year 1965 that our story begins. Our protagonists are Stephen, Sione, Kolo, David, Luke and Mano. All of them were students at a strict Catholic boarding school in Nuku'alofa, the capital of the Kingdom of Tonga. These boys, aged between 16 and 18, had one thing in common. They were tired of the school's rules and longed to escape, craving adventure. So, they came up with the idea to sail about 800 kilometers to the Fiji Islands, and perhaps even further to New Zealand. But none of them had a boat. So, they decided to steal a random fishing boat from the area. They spent very little time preparing for the journey. All they packed in their bags were a small gas stove, 2 bags of bananas and a few coconuts. Forget taking a compass. They didn't even think to bring a map. So, on June 18th, after loading their supplies onto the stolen boat, they set sail from the shore heading toward Fiji. That evening, no one noticed the small boat leaving the harbour. There was only a light breeze, the sky was clear, and their journey began without any issues. After travelling about 8 kilometres north, they dropped anchor to spend the night, and made a big mistake by falling asleep. It was at this point that their smooth journey took a dark turn. In the middle of the night, out of nowhere, a powerful storm hit, dragging the boat southwest. Strong winds broke the rudder and tore the sail, while some of the oars and food were lost overboard. All they could see around them were the rising waves. When the boys didn't return home that night, their families and local authorities began searching for them. Once they discovered the fishing boat was missing, they quickly realized the boys had taken it. However, the storm delayed the search efforts by 2 days, and since no one knew about their plan, no one had any idea where to look for them. The country's economy relied on agriculture, fishing and tourism, but due to its distance from other nations and its complex transportation system, doing business here had always been difficult. As a result, it was a fairly poor nation, and it wasn't surprising that these 6 boys, dreaming of a better life, decided to head to Fiji, the wealthiest country in the Pacific. After a week of searching, the boys were nowhere to be found on any island in Tonga or Fiji. Almost everyone believed they had drowned, but that wasn't the case. Surprisingly, the boys were still alive. As they continued drifting in the ocean, they stared at the horizon, hoping to catch sight of land. By the end of the 4th day, after they had finished their last bit of food, they continued on, hungry and thirsty, with no idea where they were. Finally, on the 8th day, they spotted a small island on the horizon. Determined not to miss it, they tore apart anything they could use as makeshift oars and began paddling towards the island with all the strength they had left. Unfortunately, as they tried to approach the shore, the boat crashed into the rocks and was damaged beyond repair. With no idea where they were, the boys climbed over the rocks and finally set foot on land. This was Atta Island, a remote place just 1.5 square kilometers in size, surrounded by steep cliffs. It lay at the far southern edge of the Pacific archipelago, 160 kilometers south of Tonga. The island was completely deserted, and there was no one to help them, as the last inhabitants had abandoned the island nearly a century ago. The saddest part of all was the tragic story behind why the island had been abandoned. Back in 1863, around 350 people lived there. The islanders frequently traded with passing ships, so when an Australian named Thomas McGrath stopped nearby, they didn't suspect anything. Thomas had been a whaler in the South Pacific, but by the early 1860s, whales were becoming scarce. So he turned to a different business, slave trading. He had an order for 150 slaves from Peru. Appearing friendly, he invited the islanders aboard his ship for trade. Once they were in the hold, sitting around a table filled with delicious food and alcohol, 144 of them believed the lie. Right in the middle of their celebration, Thomas gave the order to lock the hold, and the ship immediately sailed away from the island. These unfortunate souls were later sold as slaves in Peru. When the King of Tonga learned of this horrific crime, he tried to rescue his people, but it was too late. The rest of the islanders, fearing more abductions, decided to evacuate, and from that time on, no one lived there, until these 6 lost boys arrived. 102 years after the islanders had left, these boys stepped onto Atta Island, unaware that they had drifted 160 kilometers south of where they had set sail. As I mentioned earlier, their destination was the Fiji Islands, northwest of Tonga, and they believed they were heading in that direction. This misconception would play a cruel trick on them later, but for now, they had to figure out how to survive on this desolate land. At first, they were too weak to start a fire, so they sustained themselves by eating shellfish, papaya and coconuts. However, there was very little of that, and their main source of food became seabirds and their eggs, which were difficult to catch. In addition to eating the birds, they drank their blood to quench their thirst, as the biggest challenge on the island was the lack of fresh water. Those first few days were the hardest. A few days later, after regaining some strength, they climbed to the top of the island and discovered remnants left behind by the former inhabitants in an old volcanic crater. Among the remains were wild taro plants, banana trees, seeds, roughly made knives, and pottery. And unexpectedly, they found wild chickens. These chickens had been left behind by the islanders when they evacuated and had somehow managed to survive and reproduce on their own. At this point, they realized that yes, people had once lived here and simply abandoned the island. What remained of the lives of those taken as slaves would now help these boys survive. They divided themselves into pairs, each group taking on different responsibilities, and created a strict schedule for tending the garden, cooking, and keeping watch. Their next step was to build a house with a roof made from palm leaves. After that, they planted a vegetable garden with edible roots they had found and built coops to keep the chickens they had discovered. To solve the water problem, they carved large containers from trees and set up a rainwater collection system using gutters. When the clothes they had arrived in quickly became unusable, they had no choice but to walk around naked. Although this was a bit embarrassing at first, they soon got used to it. It took them nearly 3 months to finally start a fire using sticks and friction after many failed attempts. This allowed them to eat cooked food for the first time in 3 months, but the fire wasn't just for cooking or warmth. They kept it burning day and night, hoping that if a rescue team came near the island, the smoke could be used as a signal. Over time, they established a routine and brought some order to their lives. With plenty of free time, they even built a primitive gym and a badminton court to keep up their physical strength. Their creativity was remarkable. Everything was handmade with great determination. They had a common goal and knew that working together was their only hope for survival. You might wonder, in a group of 6, did they never fight? Of course they did. In case of disagreements, the 2 parties would go to opposite ends of the island, sit alone for a few hours to clear their heads, and then return to calmly discuss the issue. This way, they always found a compromise that worked for everyone. But most of the time, they got along well, singing songs in the evenings accompanied by a guitar they made from wood, nails, and wires taken from the boat. Every day, they started and ended their day with songs and prayers. They may not have always agreed on everything, but they knew they had to come together, work as a team, and do whatever it took to survive. One day, one of them fell off a cliff while trying to catch a bird and broke his leg. The others immediately climbed down after him and helped him back up. They splintered his leg with a piece of wood and wrapped it with leaves. While he healed, his friends shared his tasks among themselves, and eventually his leg healed completely, leaving only a small scar where the break had been. After 6 months on the island, no one had come, and no one had left. They had almost completely lost hope of returning home. So, did they ever try to leave? Yes, but only once. Their only attempt to escape was building a raft from logs tied together with vines. They set out from the southern side of the island and made it a few hundred meters before the raft broke apart in the waves, forcing them to return. In hindsight, this turned out to be a stroke of luck. Believing they were further north than they actually were, they had decided to head south. If their plan had worked, they would have found themselves in the open ocean, with nothing ahead but Antarctica. After 15 months, on September 11, 1966, something incredible happened. An Australian fisherman named Peter Warner, captain of a fishing boat, was searching for fishing grounds near the island, which he knew had been abandoned for nearly a century. While scanning the area, he noticed burnt patches of grass on the cliffs. Then, suddenly, he heard a shout. At first, he thought it was the sound of seabirds. But as he got closer and looked through his binoculars, he saw a group of naked people. Approaching cautiously, he then noticed one of them swimming toward his boat. Then, 5 more boys jumped off the cliff into the water and began swimming toward the boat. At the time, it wasn't uncommon for dangerous criminals to be abandoned on remote islands, so Peter wasn't too eager to let them on board. However, his sense of compassion and curiosity won out, and he eventually helped them onto the boat. One of the boys, speaking in English, explained that they had escaped from school, had a boat accident, and had been stranded there for over a year. At first, Peter was skeptical of their story. To verify if they were telling the truth, he radioed the Coast Guard in the capital, Nuku'alofa, and gave them the boys' names. After a tense 20-minute wait, a tearful voice on the other end of the radio confirmed that these were the very boys who had long been presumed dead. Peter took them all home, where they were joyfully reunited with their families, who had been waiting for them on the shore. Surviving and making it back home was nothing short of a miracle, but that miracle was soon overshadowed by their arrest for stealing the boat. The man whose boat they had taken 15 months earlier had filed a complaint, and all of them were thrown in jail. Believing that their story of survival was perfect material for a Hollywood film, Peter went to see the boat owner. He paid him £150 and negotiated the boys' release on the condition that they would collaborate on the film project. The story of 6 boys stranded on an island became something people would talk about for years. Interestingly, when doctors examined them, they were amazed at how healthy the boys were, especially at how perfectly the leg of the boy who had broken it had healed. Peter was hailed as a national hero, and shortly afterward, he commissioned a new boat, naming it Arta. The boys returned to the island on this new ship to film a documentary about their survival. Later, Peter offered them a chance to see the world beyond Tonga, hiring all of them as crew members on his ship. This story shows that, despite some small disagreements, they were able to rely on each other, live together harmoniously, find water, build shelter, and divide tasks fairly. In a situation that could easily bring out the worst in human nature, these boys' story is a remarkable tale of resilience, empathy, and human kindness. Not only did they survive, but they thrived and grew, maintaining their humanity throughout. Unlike many survival stories we've heard, filled with violence and tragedy, this one proves that not all such situations end in chaos and murder. So, let me ask you something a bit classic, considering our theme of being stranded on an island. If you were stranded on an island, what 3 things would you want to have with you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please make sure to do so, and don't forget to like the video. I'm off to work on the next video for you all. Take care, and see you soon.